Hello, and welcome to my presentation. I will be discussing the establishment of Anglo-Saxon culture in Britain, giving us an idea where and how Old English, as we call it today, got its start. As we find in history, there are several versions that we can read about. There are legends mixed in there. There's very little concrete evidence from this time period, lending the study to theories and debates. We get a whole lot more information beginning in the 8th century, but still, this made for interesting reading, although I wound up with more questions than answers. The time of the Anglo-Saxons is considered from the end of Roman control in the early 5th century to the emergence of the Kingdom of England occurring during the 9th and 10th centuries. Within this time period is the early period of Anglo-Saxons, which covers 400 to 700 AD, or the 5th to 7th centuries. In this time period, the Heptarchy, or Seven Kingdoms, was established by the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes from the continent. And this is a work of art from 1130 depicting the Germanic tribes crossing the Channel to the island of Britain. I think it's just beautiful. In 410, the Roman Empire, unable to defend itself against Germanic tribes expanding in Western Europe, withdrew from Britain, leaving it open to invaders. Vortigern, the ruler of Britons, invited Anglo-Saxon and Jute mercenaries to help defend the kingdom against the incoming Picts and Scotti. The mercenaries revolted, establishing their own settlements, which would develop into small kingdoms and eventually be referred to as the Heptarchy. Pam Crabtree of Princeton University said that the 5th century was one of the most significant events in British history since it resulted in profound changes in settlement patterns, in political organization, and in language. Now here on this slide are two maps. The first one on your left shows those invading Picts and Scotti, and then the location of the Romano-Britons, and that was in 383 to 410 that was happening, and then the Romans were out by 410. And then in the map on the right, it shows the continent and the Germanic tribes crossing the English Channel and establishing settlements, mainly along the coast where those Romano-Britons were, and then some theories suggest that they were forced westward. The Jutes you see are in blue, the Angles in orange, and the Saxons in red. Those eventually developed into the kingdoms known as the Heptarchy. The Angles settled 3 of the kingdoms, East Anglia, which eventually fell to Mercia in 794. Mercia was in the region known as Midlands and reigned supreme, eventually absorbing the other kingdoms except for Northumbria. Northumbria is what is now northern England or southeast Scotland, independent until the mid-10th century. The Saxons settled 3 kingdoms as well. Wessex, which was Cadwala's home, invaded by Danes in 871. Essex, Kingdom of East Saxon, was ceded to Wessex in 825, and Sussex, you guessed it, Kingdom of the South Saxons, was annexed by Wessex in 827. And finally, Kent, settled by the Jutes, is where Christianization began on the island in 597, and this was eventually absorbed into Wessex. A lot of literature I read suggested the names of the kingdoms were more geographical than cultural in nature. There were suggestions, or they were considered more suggestions about location than the people of that area. The geographical features of specific locations contributed to localism and autonomy, like the mountainous terrain, forested river valleys, and remote upland moors. This map shows more of the settling of those Germanic tribes, and that's in red and pink and that brown color. And I think, yes, red, pink, and that brown yellow color. The influx of Anglo-Saxon migrants changed the language and cultural identity of Britain. In my readings, I found differing ideas in regard to the seven kingdoms. Heptarchy implies an equality that most likely didn't exist between the kingdoms. Michael Frassetto said, although heptarchy is a convenient term, it conveys a false impression of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of England. And then he went on to say that the term is best relegated to history's trash heap. And I thought, well, okay. Everybody has their ideas, don't they? I wanted to be sure and highlight some of the debates surrounding the history of Anglo-Saxons. First, there is not a lot of information for this period. Beginning in the 8th century, we get a lot more of a written history of the people. I read an interesting article discussing the name Anglo-Saxon, in which the author said the term carries many meanings among cultures and across time. It was initially introduced not by the people with that name, but later in the 8th century, it was introduced as a way to distinguish between the continent people and the people of the island. Another debate centers on the migration of the Germanic tribes. The two main theories discuss whether the tribes migrated all at once in a mass influx, or did they move independently in small groups. There are questions about, did just warriors come over, or were entire clans coming over and settling? This leads to the debate focused on the Romano-British people. Were they enslaved, driven west, and slaughtered? Or did they coexist and intermarry within the Germanic people? A central piece of evidence to these debates resides in the language of this time, which is Old English, of course, what we call it now. The Romano-British spoke British Celtic or British Latin, but by the 8th century, the language we now refer to as Old English was spoken. The language had few remnants of the original Celtic or Latin, which was unusual because German invaders in other lands often picked up the local language. But in this instance, they replaced the language of the Britons. So that's an interesting piece of information. Though I found more questions really than I did answers in my research, I enjoyed learning more about the cultural circumstances, the political, the geographical circumstances surrounding the language that we're studying. Please let me know if you have any questions, and along with my video, I've posted an annotated bibliography for my sources. I thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing your upcoming videos as well.